Tales Under a Broken Sky, Episode 18, Pretender, Chapter 2, A Royal Victory. The battlefield had finally fallen silent, but it was not an empty silence. The harsh calls of crows and ravens filled the air as they flitted from corpse to corpse, gorging themselves on fresh meat. The cries and moans of the injured and dying were punctuated by the steel mercy of the victors. After hours of chaos, however, there was nothing else to call it. No other words could describe the sense of emptiness, of hollowness that filled the vacant space left behind after the battle. It was the silence of the dead, and the living were no longer welcome here. That silence hung heavy on the shoulders of Prince Cassian as he rode through the aftermath of the carnage, followed closely by his small entourage of bodyguards and advisors. He tried not to look at the dead. Every death weighed on him. These were his people, his subjects. They may have died serving the interest of a traitor, but they had also died defending their homeland. Is death a fitting reward for their loyalty? Cassian forced himself to look past the growing mounds of corpses, his men already busy stacking firewood for the pyres that would burn through the night. It was a harsh send-off for the men of this land. Deep in the heart of the Empire's agricultural belt, they worshipped the land, not the sky. It was not customary to burn the dead, and it would certainly not earn him any favours with his newly conquered subjects. He grimaced. He had vowed never to put politics above the lives of his people. But here he was, disrespecting their customs and their dead. There just wasn't enough time. There never seemed to be enough time. Stopping to dig graves and inter the bodies would cost precious days. Days they could ill afford to lose with the encroaching winter. Left where they were, the bodies would rot and fester. The remaining townspeople, those not slain on the battlefield, would only suffer. Cassian had seen firsthand the misery and death that followed war. At least death on the battlefield was quick, the suffering soon over. But a slow, agonizing death from fever and disease, covered in sores and slathered in your own filth, was a horror all of its own. He should be rejoicing in the victory, another step towards reclaiming his father's throne. But what was there to celebrate in slaughter, in the pointless loss of life? His cause was just, the usurper a tyrant. But as the war dragged on, month after month, season after season, he had lost sight of the end. All he could see was never-ending war, and an endless pile of corpses left in its wake. Cassian's path to the town brought him close to one of the pyres. He bowed his head as he passed, pressing a hand to his chest. Accept this offering, which has today watered your land in the blood of those who call it home. I pray you guide those lost souls to your hallowed halls, so they may find peace in your embrace. May you show them more mercy than I. Sparing one last look at the pyre, Cassian spurred his horse on and hurried towards the town. The heavy wooden gate swung open slowly as Cassian and his entourage approached the walls. His soldiers paused their work as he passed, standing to salute and cheer as he made the final approach towards the town. He returned the salute dutifully. His men had earned their victory, even if his own heart was heavy. Beyond the gates, Cassian could see clusters of people huddled together, mostly women and children. The townspeople looked as ragged and worn as his own heart felt. War came with many overlooked consequences, and the people here were a prime example of that. Trade and commerce had suffered heavy blows in recent months, merchants often choosing to take their wares to more secure markets closer to the capital. Closer to home was the disruption his own army had caused. Feeding that many men was not an insignificant endeavour. Prohibiting all forms of looting, Cassian had opened his own coffers to ensure that all supplies for the army were bought and paid for fairly. Even so, the army's passing depleted food stores and reserves more rapidly than he would have liked. No matter how fair the remuneration was, he was painfully aware of how the uneven power dynamic impacted trade negotiations. Reserves that would normally have been off limits for trade were freely opened, both in hopes that the army would pass by quickly, and in fear of the consequences of refusing trade. No amount of reassurance on his part seemed to be enough to assuage those concerns. Cassian saw the devastating impact of war everywhere he looked. The encroaching winter would only serve to worsen what was already a dire situation across the once thriving agricultural belt. The next casualties in the war wouldn't be soldiers or merchants or nobility. It would be the peasantry. And it was his fault. No amount of reassurance or support from his advisors could change that. But what was he to do? Give in to the tyrant sitting on his father's throne? Allow the usurper free rein to exploit the hard work and toil of his people? And worse, what about all the suffering that had already occurred? Would it all be for naught? A disorientating flurry of anger and guilt stormed in Cassian's chest. Ahead, his people cowered in fear and starvation, and to either side, his men cheered him on as a champion, as a hero. Something broke inside Cassian, and he spurred his horse around before the entrance to the town. He sat tall in the saddle, gazing over the heads of his men at the battlefield he had just left behind. There has to be some end to this madness. Cassian raised his voice, struggling to be heard over the shouting of the soldiers. Today, we have won a great battle. A chorus of chanting erupted from the men. The calls only served to stoke his anger. Cassian's grip tightened on his reins, and he readied himself to shout over the tumult. To his right, someone blew a long, piercing note on a horn, and the crowd of soldiers reluctantly settled into silence. Cassian sat in that silence for a moment, scanning the faces in the crowd before he started to speak again. Today, we have won a great battle, but it is not a victory. The army we fought today, they were not soldiers. They were not part of the king's army. They were smiths and farmers, bakers, weavers, and stonemasons. They were our own people, the very same people we fight for, that we fight to free from the usurper's tyranny. Today, they stood to defend their homeland from an invader, to fight for a king they have pledged their loyalty to a king that would betray them in an instant if it suited their purposes. Today was not a victory for us. The suffering caused by this war can only help to serve the interests of those we seek to defeat. This kingdom is nothing without its people, and today we will mourn the deaths of those people. We will honour them and their families. We will treat them with the same respect we treat our own. We will not trade with these people. We will not deplete their resources, nor use their homes for shelter. Today, we will open our stores to them and render what assistance we can. Sir Thomas, Cassian turned to face one of his captains. You will arrange whatever is required. Send your men out amongst the people and find out what they need. Clean water, shelter, firewood, food, it matters not. Today, we shall provide for our people. Today shall be the start of what we set out to do when we first marched. Today, we shall reclaim our people and our home." The burst of cheers from the soldiers was deafening as Cassian turned towards the gates of the town and prepared to meet the people. What Cassian saw as he entered the town sickened him. This was a trading town, situated in the middle of one of the most prosperous parts of the empire. Yet everyone he saw was on the verge of starvation, and many well past. Dark-rimmed eyes, sunk deep into hollow faces, watched him nervously as he rode through the gate. "Pive, take that traitor." Cassian had seen it all before. The town stores and winter reserves commandeered by the usurper to feed the troops he was amassing for protection around the capital, leaving them with nothing. And without regular trade, which had been hampered by the war, they had been unable to balance that deficit. Anyone strong enough to hold a sword or shoot a bow had been recruited into the army and sent to war, leaving behind only the weak, sick, and infirm, those not able to track and hunt or work the land. These people had been left to starve. He felt guilt at his own part in that, but he never requested more than his troops needed, or the communities they bartered with could spare. His men might have grumbled about hunger from time to time, but they also held their heads proud while doing so. They were not just fighting for the people, they were the people. They would not let their own starve just to fill their own bellies at night. Not like the parasites hiding behind the walls of the capital. Cassian rode past a crowd of people at the gates, trying not to let his gaze linger too long on their misery. There wasn't a man in that crowd who had seen less than 50 winters. The silent cluster of people was comprised entirely of women, children, and the elderly. The usurper had sent all of the men to fight, a neat and tidy political move, both removing men that could potentially join Cassian's cause, while also limiting the support he could garner from newly liberated towns. Who would support the man who slaughtered their father, their husband, their son? "My lord, a word please." Cassian grimaced before turning to the man addressing him. "Lord Edward, what can I do for you on this fine afternoon?" He already knew what the man wanted. Lord Edward Cassington was the man he had appointed to manage the army's supply chain. The Chancellor, as he liked to be called, was a constant thorn in his side. If he wasn't bemoaning the dire state of their supplies, he was proposing new and increasingly complex rationing measures. Cassian couldn't deny that Edward was a genius with numbers, and absolutely meticulous with his records and bookkeeping. He just wished the man's personality extended beyond fiscal responsibility and frugality. "My lord, these new measures, while admirable and noble, may prove to be problematic." "How so, Lord Edward? Do you not think these people deserve our aid? Some brief respite from the suffering delivered unto them by the usurper?" No, my lord, of course not. Your actions are admirable, a testament to the nobility of your bloodline. But supplies are tight, and with the encroaching winter, there was some quality to Cassington's voice that always rubbed Cassian the wrong way. The quick patter of his brusqueness conveyed a sense of both insubordination and dutiful sycophancy. He was an asset to be sure. Cassian doubted his rebellion would have moved as quickly, or lasted as long as it had, without his logistical expertise. But Meru be blessed, he was frustrating to deal with. These people, my people, our people, are in dire need of aid, Lord Cassington, and I'm not too proud to admit that their current deplorable position is partly our doing. As righteous as our cause may be, we cannot deny this. The usurper may not care for the conditions of his subjects, but Bive take me, I will not stand by and let them rot in squalor. Cassian's tone might have been a bit sharp, but he didn't regret the rebuke. Lord Edward wasn't a bad man. He knew his advisor was already mentally tallying the cost and logistics of implementing his plan, but he was single-minded in the fulfillment of his duties and required frequent reminders as to the nature of their undertaking. You are right, of course, my lord, forgive me, but my concerns, they are not unfounded. Cassian stopped himself short of responding. His advisor was never this forward with him, even at his most infuriating. He shifted further in his saddle and looked closely at the man. Lord Edward was fidgeting nervously with his reins, and his eyes were downcast, flitting away as Cassian attempted to meet them. Shame? Bawa, there's something he's not telling me. He waited for Edward to work up the courage. There was nothing to be gained in forcing the man to speak. Evidently something was bothering him. Lord Cassington was not a man to be hesitant in speaking his mind. My latest tally of supplies, my lord. It appears that we have less in our stores than my previous count indicated. Cassian clenched his jaw, biting down on his tongue as he delayed his response. His initial reaction was to question Edward's accuracy, but that would have been foolhardy. Lord Cassington was meticulous in his work. Finding a single grain of wheat in a bushel of barley was more likely than finding an error in his work. And Edward was proud to a fault. There was no surer way to lose the confidence of a proud man than bruising that pride. So he stayed silent and waited for the man to continue. Before you ask, my lord, I have rechecked my count. If I was in error, then I cannot find it. I was personally present for every barrel and crate we counted. Wastage or spoilage, maybe? No, my lord. If we had that much waste or spoiled goods, it would have come to my attention much sooner. This is not an insignificant discrepancy. How significant? We had rations for 3 months last count, my lord. We have less than a month left now. Cassian's heart sank. How long between the counts, Edward? 1 month, my lord. So waste and spoilage couldn't account for that. That was a factor in my estimates, lord. Accepting a greater than 100-fold increase, and there is no need to tell you how unlikely such a scenario is, I can say with full confidence, it is certainly not a factor. Theft. It remained unspoken between the pair, but the understanding was clear, and not just small-scale pilfering from a few soldiers looking for extra apples. On that scale, it had to be premeditated. Sabotage. Cassian's gut churned. Less than a month? My order still stands, Edward. See to it that everyone in this town gets their fair share tonight. Make it stretch as much as you can, stew, broth, whatever, but the people get fed. I want a team on the town water supply as well. If the well is contaminated, I want a new one found and dug before we leave. Clear what we can of the fields, and send men out to scout whatever crops might still be unharvested, if any. We can spare some men to stay behind and help the village harvest and rebuild stores. I want the full inventory of the town's livestock by the end of the day. I want to know what we're dealing with. We take nothing from them, not as much as an apple. Am I clear? Lord Edward met his eyes for the first time in their conversation. His earlier shame now replaced by dogged determination. It paid to trust in people. Consider it done, my lord. We will speak of that other matter later, Lord Cassington. Until then, not a word to anyone. Morale is high, and I will not taint our victory here today. Understood, my lord. Lord Edward bowed low in his saddle and nodded in approval towards Cassian before he reined his horse in and turned back towards the town gates. Cassian allowed himself a smile before he turned back and continued his advance through the town square. Infuriating as the man might be, he got things done. And there was a lot to do. Cassian was passing the last of the crowd when a huddled figure caught his attention. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the man that struck a nerve with him. Cassian reined his horse in and bent low over the saddle to get a better view under the man's hood. His eyes widened in surprise as he got a good look at the man's face. Robert? Cassian couldn't hide the surprise in his voice, and the name stopped the man in his tracks as he tried to slip away into the crowd. I thought you died in the coup. What in Bive's name are you doing here? Identified, the man stopped his efforts to get away and sighed before slipping off his hood. My lord, the man you once knew died that night. If I bear any resemblance to your father's physician, I am but a fleeting shadow of that man. Cassian regarded his old acquaintance, looking him up and down before sliding from the saddle. Robert wasn't in any better shape than the rest of the starving crowd. His clothes were tattered and stained, his cheekbones protruded disturbingly from his face, and there was a hollow look to the once bright eyes Cassian had known as a child. None of us are what we were back then, old friend. Cassian clapped Robert on the shoulder and gestured to the nearest guard for a horse. The world changed that day. Fortunes were turned on their heads. We all lost something of ourselves. My lord, your father was a good man, but I barely escaped with my life. And my family. Robert's voice choked off, and he gazed silently at the ground. Cassian could feel the grief shuddering in his shoulders. Come, you will dine with me tonight, Robert. It's the least I can do for an old friend. Apologies, my lord. I forget myself. But I can't accept. How can I dine, knowing the hunger that these people feel? Cassian smiled softly. I have already given the order and opened my stores for the people this night. You can dine without guilt, my friend. And Cassian is fine. You treated more than your fair share of my childhood injuries. My lord, I've done what I can for these people, but not nearly enough. If the usurper ever found out I was here, if he caught wind of what I was doing. These people are under my protection now, Robert. Come, dine with me, and let me put your fears to rest. Robert looked over his shoulder, eyeing the crowd behind him uncertainly. Those closest to hear the exchange were staring in a mix of awe and confusion and anger. One woman, towards the edge, spat disgustedly in his direction before turning away, dragging her three bedraggled children behind her. The former physician sighed. I fear I might not be too welcome here anymore. I put their families, their children, in danger with my presence. Cassian didn't know what to say to that. He'd weathered his own share of angry gazes from people in the towns he'd recaptured. He bore it as a duty. But Robert had lived among these people, shared his skills, helped them. Cassian found it hard to imagine how Robert must feel at the prospect of being shunned by those very same people. He climbed into his saddle as one of the soldiers appeared with a spare mount. Let us ride, Robert. I wish to speak to you further, with less inquisitive eyes watching. Cassian watched with growing sadness as the soldier helped the old man, nothing more than a bag of bones now, onto his horse. Forcing his attention away from the crowd, Cassian spurred his horse forward and made his way towards the keep at the centre of the town. We've all become what we must, but what has it cost us? Welcome, folks, to episode 18 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I'm your host, Keith, and I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. This week is the second chapter of Pretender. In this episode, I introduce Cassian, the son of the deposed king, in the midst of his campaign to overthrow the usurper. Cassian is a much different character to Darian. He has been raised to a life of duty and obligation, and is increasingly concerned about the welfare of his people and the impact that the war is having on them. While his campaign has so far been met with success, he is unsure how he feels about his victories. Formerly prosperous towns and villages are now destitute and starving, and he finds it hard to celebrate his victories as all he can see is the devastation caused by the war. He is leaning heavily on his desire and duty to free the people from the oppressive regime installed by the man who overthrew his father to keep himself motivated, and that burden is growing heavier with every battle. Introduced here as well are a few other threads of the plot. Lord Cassington, his treasurer, is going to have a big part in upcoming chapters, and the character of Robert, his father's physician, is also going to feature prominently in the future. The theft from the stores and their deteriorating supply issue is also another plotline that will have major consequences in Cassian's decision-making in the near future. I really enjoyed writing this chapter. Cassian is a much different character to Darian, and although they both share a strong sense of honour, their ideas of duty, loyalty, and responsibility differ dramatically. It was also a lot of fun to add more flavour and colour into the world, adding in additional characters, building up the plot lines, giving more of a sense of place, as well as looking at the impact of war on those not caught up in the fighting. It feels good to finally get this story down on paper. I have a huge piece of this planned out in detail, probably about 3/4, maybe a little bit more of the actual plotline, but I've never actually got around to creating a legible draft. So it feels like a big step forward for me with this story, and I'm really looking forward to expanding on it in future episodes. In other news, there is no trailer for the next episode. It's also going to drop a lot sooner than usual, as it's getting close to Halloween and I'm away at a gaming convention this weekend. So what I'm going to do is I'm doing a recording outside of my house of a little Halloween/gaming convention themed story I've been working on. And I'm going to take a bash at editing an episode on my tablet rather than on my PC at home. And it's also another excuse to finally take my Zoom H4 for a trial run. I got it a couple of months back and I haven't really done too much with it yet. I have a lot of fun ideas for this upcoming episode, and it should also be a kind of an interesting new departure in my process of writing, editing, and recording these episodes. I'm going to try to make it kind of more raw, found footage type storytelling. And it's also going to be interesting not being stuck behind my desk as I'm recording. So keep an eye out for it. It should be up within the week, probably by Halloween at the latest. Until next time. Thank you for listening to episode 18 of Tales Under a Broken Sky. I hope you enjoyed this week's production as much as I enjoyed writing and recording it. If you did enjoy it, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your platform of choice and leaving a rating and/or review. Thank you again for your time.